Proficiency-based learning may sound at first like another bit of bureaucratic jargon, but it's a term residents, voters, and parents in particular may start hearing more about in coming months. The general goal is to ensure that students are acquiring the knowledge and skills that are deemed to be essential to success in school and later life. If students fail to meet expected learning standards, then they should typically receive additional instruction, practice time, and academic support to help them achieve proficiency or meet expected standards, instead of simply being promoted on to the next grade. Proficiency-based learning is gradually being introduced into Vermont schools, along with a new grading structure, sometimes called proficiency-based grading. In some places that's gone well, in others it's been more controversial. Under legislation passed in 2013 and known as Act 77, Vermont schools are supposed to have a proficiency-based learning system and evaluation structure in place by 2020. But the education agency has defined that as a soft target, indicating some flexibility might be involved. So we turn to the state's education secretary, Daniel French, and a former superintendent of the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union for more information.
You know, it's important to talk about the history of the initiative, and we're talking about Act 77, which was passed in 2013, I believe. And we can go back a little further in Vermont, as other places in the country. We're concerned with high school reform, I think, essentially, around maybe 2002 in Vermont. Sometime in that time frame, we had a document called High Schools on the Move. And I think the concerns were twofold. One is, people were increasingly critical of what students were coming out of high school being able to do. It's like we were looking at a skills deficit in some areas. I've heard repeatedly when I was superintendent down in this neck of the woods, all students, I hear from business owners, so students can't do, make change or whatever those basic competencies are. Now we use the word proficiency, right? Students didn't seem to be proficient. And so that was one concern. And the other concern I hear from students themselves, and maybe I don't know what your experience was in what year you graduated from high school, but the perennial issue from high school students that, when am I ever going to use this? So those two concerns sort of come together, I think, in a reform effort sometime around 2002, 2004, to make high schools more relevant. And I think, from my perspective, having lived under the No Child Left Behind Act, which I think was a misguided reform initiative, to say the least, we made some inroads with through standards and improving the rigor, I think, of the education quality of high school. But then the question remains: is it like at some point you can only go so far with that, and at some point you need to make high school more relevant to students and also more relevant to employers and applicable, to the real world. So, hence we end up with Act 77 in 2013, and Act 77 has three components to it. One of which is proficiency-based learning. The other two are flexible pathways, the idea that students should have flexibility in how they navigate the high school curriculum, including better access to CTE programs, the career technical education programs. And then the second was the idea of a personalized learning plan, that we somehow develop a plan for each student so they could focus on earlier on and what careers they might be interested in to help inform their education path based on their aspirations. So the three of those things, or three strategies, are the components of Act 77, flexible pathways, PLPs, personalized learning plans, and proficiency-based learning. And what's happened, I think, since 2013 is that it's been really unevenly implemented around the state. And a lot of, we've had made some significant headway on flexible pathways, not so much on personalized learning plans. And, a lot of districts who got into proficiency-based learning got into proficiency-based grading, which is not what's required in the regulation or the law, but often is associated with proficiency-based learning. But the way the regulation is set up, you could still do traditional grading and accomplish proficiency-based learning if you wanted to. Districts have that flexibility. And I think what I've noticed as secretary now is that districts that have gone farther down the path and really got involved with proficiency-based grading, sort of from a political perspective in their communities, without having figured out how to do transcripts, for instance. It's been really problematic from a political perspective. So I think, we shouldn't be surprised in our state of local control that a policy of this complex has been implemented very unevenly around the state. But I think we still have to acknowledge that it's important to make high school more relevant for students and also figure out a way to incorporate their aspirations as a centerpiece of the design of high school education. The 2020 date basically requires high schools to adopt proficiency-based learning graduation requirements. But it's, from my perspective, very unusual to have a date in a regulation. So it'd be, comparably, if we thought of something like, by what date you would have to teach English as a high school graduation requirement. I mean, we don't have like hard dates for things like that. They're supposed to be benchmark quality standards, and then we measure your progress towards meeting them. So it's unusual that we have a date. So I've more or less signaled the secretary. I'm not in a position as secretary to not ensure regulations are being implemented, but we have some accountability measures in place, mainly the integrated field review that asks districts to give us some evidence and report on their progress to achieving that end. But there's no penalty, if you will, in the regulation, and I've on the record said I don't support due dates in any regulation. I think it's an inappropriate use of a regulation.
Skylar LeBombard is the Director of Teaching and Learning for the Bennington-Rutland Supervisory Union, and he tells us how the process is going on the local level.
Proficiency-based learning is a way to measure what students know, understand, and are able to do in a way that traditional educational models don't really do. The greatest impact that families will see is in the method that it's reported out via a report card or some other method. Traditional grading practices would be an A to F scale, and it wouldn't necessarily be an accurate reflection of what students know, understand, and are able to do. Things like extra credit would be calculated in that score, whether it's an alphabetic score or otherwise. Things like attendance could have an impact on those things as well. And in a proficiency-based grading model, it's really focused on a specific skill that a student's working on and has demonstrated through their work and evidence. And we take those things like extra credit out of the equation, and we really determine grades based on student ability instead of calculating grades based on a traditional mathematical formula. So for us, our latest round of report cards are going to be going out in December. And for all 6 of our schools, they will be reporting out on that small grain size, so specific skills. It'll be really the first time that that's happened. We've been working our way up into to this moment and being iterative and making sure that teachers are prepared. Because it's one thing to report out in this way, and it's another thing to change your instructional practice in a way that supports this reporting out. So we're giving ourselves a little bit of runway to do that, and this first round of report cards for this year will be the first time that all 6 of our communities have experienced getting report cards in that way. And I think it is a much more accurate representation. It provides families way more information than an A or a B might. We're really up against 200 years of kind of institution of traditional education practices. So it is an ambitious timeline. I know that some of my colleagues that run secondary schools, they are reporting out in this way now, but they're also reporting out through traditional methods like a GPA so that it's more digestible for college applications, because I know that college admissions is a concern. There's a Great Schools Partnership had surveyed some of the top colleges in the Northeast, and the information that they received didn't signify that using a proficiency-based transcript would affect enrollment at all, or acceptance rates, I should say. For us, we're really rolling things with all 6 of our schools this year when it comes to reporting out on a smaller grain size and specific skills for kids. What that looks like is under any specific mathematical domain, like numbers and operations or something of that nature, it'll have a specific skill that is backed by evidence of data collection or student work samples that we could show parents that this is where they are in their development. And that's kind of how we are approaching it. It is an iterative process. It's brand new, really, as far as the system change. So we're learning every time we have a reporting out process. And we can just strive to get better. And I think that's kind of the general feeling around the state, because I know the state didn't necessarily promote one specific model of how to approach this. So different school systems are approaching it differently. They're identifying different proficiencies and indicators and transferable skills and all of those things.
Meanwhile, what about independent schools like Long Trail School in Dorset? Under the law, they are not bound by the new proficiency-based learning approach, but Headmaster Seth Linfield and Mary Ellen Mega, the Dean of Academics and Faculty, described what they have been doing, which has been influenced by the school's International Baccalaureate program.
At Long Trail School, we're always in deep dialogue among our faculty, with our students, on what makes for the strongest learning. There's a strong element of proficiency-based learning which is already incorporated into the International Baccalaureate curriculum. Long Trail School was the first IB school in Vermont. Essentially, IB measures learning, measures competencies rather than how much time one is spending in a seat. That influences our whole overall philosophy, so that while we are conscious of what and respect what takes place around us in the state, this focusing on real learning, real mastery, is an internal Long Trail process in any event.
And every student in Long Trail, whether or not they're in the IB program or not, basically gets the same kind of assessment?
Yes, all of our programs, the diploma program is really for 11th and 12th graders, but all of our upper school classes are designed to measure competencies similar to IB starting in grade 6. But so we're already focused on those measured outcomes and measuring whether students have mastered the material or not, versus, like Seth said, have they finished the course. We want them to be able to master the material.
Now, we have an advantage with the International Baccalaureate that there is a consistency in the approaches and in the assessments internationally. There are tests and projects and papers that are graded across the world within the IB program, and colleges rely on that and have confidence in the validity and reliability of what IB assessments make. So there's going to be a responsibility on the high schools to say, this is how we lessen the subjectivity and put the assessments of our students in context. And I think high schools will be able to meet that responsibility, and colleges are going out of their way to say, high schools, you partner with us, we can make this work together. Mm-hmm.
Soft target or not, proficiency-based learning is likely to be a term getting more usage going forward as schools gear up for it. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.